Welcome to the Regenaissance Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Griggs. Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Griggs, and I'm the host of the Regenaissance Podcast. And today alongside me, I have Allred from Royal Family Farm. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Ryan. Excited to catch up.
I guess to really get started, because I love talking with just the actual background growing up in a farm, and I noticed that, did you grow up on a farm?
Yeah, here in Central Washington, middle of the state, right between Seattle and Spokane is Royal City. And I grew up on mainly a potato farm. That's what my dad's primary crop was. But then we did apples and cherries as I got a little bit older. And then obviously on the potato farm, we were growing a lot of different crops in that rotation. But grew up as a grunt farm worker, laborer.
Was that something as you were experiencing that growing up that you knew later on in life that you would continue on that legacy?
I loved it. I loved a lot of everything about it. I loved, except the fact that I was working like a dog, and I don't love thinning apples or pulling weeds. But nonetheless, I loved it, and I think for the most part, I always knew it's what I wanted to do.
I guess just based off of that too, because I've noticed especially with the regenerative agriculture is becoming more mainstream per se, and more folks like myself that had the realization that we'd been so disconnected from our food and had never visited a ranch or farm. And most of the time we've gotten our food from the grocery store. And then we see the appeal of getting out in the land and getting off the grid per se and starting a farm. Whenever you just mentioned that you liked a lot of the aspects of farming growing up, but not things such as the weeds and apple picking and whatnot. Despite all of that, I guess what was the reasoning behind still continuing on the farm? Because it's a completely different lifestyle. If you want to do that for the long haul, especially you're trying to raise a family. Because from outside looking in, it looks incredible. You're outside tilling, or you're tending the land, and then you have the highest quality food that you can get, and then you're with your family, and it looks all sunshines and rainbows. But obviously, that's not the case. So I was hoping you could just shed light on. I'm trying to figure out how I could best frame that question. Is I guess essentially, how could we get more of the younger generation into agriculture, especially based off of your experiences growing up, and then to where you're at now?
Yeah, I think when you ask that question, where my head goes is I'm actually raising kids now on the farm, and I got a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old who are out with the baby calves right now, bottle feeding them and stuff. And the other day, I was talking to my wife about kind of this concept of, okay, why are we making our kids work? Why is this so valuable? And I realized that my 6-year-old, who's pretty picky, when he's out there working, he's working with a couple Hispanic guys who share their lunch with him. And my 6-year-old, who's picky, just eats I don't even know what it was, tacos or tamales. My wife's like, yeah, I picked him up and he was eating his tacos. And anyway, long story short, you realize when you grow up on a farm, just the cause and effect, right? The hard work, working on the farm, being out there with your hands, literally creating, brings a fantastic feeling. It brings, the effect is joy and happiness, and you feel good. Like it's just one of those things that when you get into it and you put a solid, like my kids right now, when they put a solid 7 hours of work in, that sucks. But they come home and they're happy as can be. And you start correlating that and getting a better balance around that. And pretty soon you realize there's very few things that can duplicate that in today's world. And farming is such a wonderful way of life. Yes, it's hard. A lot of it, maybe even most of it, is hard. But that hard can be fun, and inevitably that hard is going to bring joy at the end of the day. So
I
That's
agree. So before starting Regenaissance, I worked on a farm in rural Pennsylvania, and that was the first time I'd ever worked on one. And I heavily relate to the feeling of having an exhausting day, but sitting in the cabin at the end of the day feeling extremely fulfilled. I mean, just like you're saying, you're actually creating, and then just seeing the whole process at work. Um, I can't really put it into other words other than it's so fulfilling, and that's also why I try to guide and help folks understand that and push them to visit local farms and ranches that are open to having people visit and potentially volunteer. Because just even one day of that, I remember the very first day, whenever I switched into agriculture and was traveling around America, I'd visit a ranch in Colorado, and I visited them on the day of processing day. And even just being there for the tail end of the process of having broiler chickens for meat, um, just having the birds and then being in the process of actually processing them and then consuming that, I just had a more of a sense of a connection to this world, but then also with my food. And that was something I had never experienced in my first 27 years of living.
yeah, I agree. It's there's really something that is almost impossible to duplicate. Then when you get to create and see the whole process of God's creation kind of unfold and unwind, and it does all of that in front of your eyes, and you're a part of that whole process. A there's such a you know it's such a blessing to be a part of.
On the topic of creating, so you grew up on the potato farm and with the royal family farming, did you start your own and go that route, or what was the impetus behind royal family farming?
Um, So it was clear to my dad and my family. I work with some uncles and cousins on their they have different farms than my dad, but still, it was clear that having cattle was a really important part to being able to regenerate and to be able to close your loop and to have some fertilizer for the soil and to be able to keep growing food without bringing in a whole bunch of imports, fertilizers and synthetics. So that timing was good. When I graduated school, I brought livestock to the operation, and I did that first by buying the neighbor's dairy. So Royal Dairy, which is a big part of Royal Family Farming, is where I kind of work most of the time. I'm raising the cattle. I'm buying the feed and grazing the cattle on my really most of my family's properties and my family's feed, and then I'm processing the manure, composting, etc., and we're getting that back into the system. So that's where I started expanding and diversifying a lot of those family operations. But I went the direction of cattle, ruminants, bringing those ruminants into the system to make the system more sustainable. And then since then, I've started breeding a bunch of our herd to Angus, and so we have a beef ranch where those are the cattle we're actually able to graze and take out and about because the dairy cows have to stay pretty close to home. Obviously, they're getting milked, but the beef animals we're able to graze them across those family operations, those family acres that range miles and miles apart. Um, and then we started processing our own beef, and then in the meantime, we've done a few other ventures where we're making skincare out of colostrum and tallow. And we installed the biggest worm farm in the world, and so our composting center has just gone kind of exponential as far as the what we're able to do with soil amendments, and we continue to expand that side of things. Everything in mind of trying to close the loop, trying to synergize all these different systems. Right? Yes, you're a potato farmer. Yes, you're a beef farmer. Yes, you're a dairy farmer. Yes, you're a fruit farmer or woodstock farmer. But once you start collaborating and connecting those dots, then you're regenerating. You're able to use the natural systems of this creation in order to grow crops for next year.
So before going to the worm farm, because I don't know if I've ever talked with anybody on that topic, so that It's really interesting. I want to go back to the dairy side of things. I'm curious. Well, the first question would be: is it for pasteurized milk or is it made for raw milk?
So our dairy is almost all going to get pasteurized. We sell to Dairy Gold, so we make a lot of milk.
Would you be able to explain that process? Because I know a lot of folks with the topic of milk don't even realize the fact that milk could be raised for what you're doing, pasteurized or raw, or the other side to where like raw farms in California, they make it
Mhm.
for raw.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you my straight. Like, so we milk 6,000 cows, 24/7. I drink raw milk, but I also grew up on this farm. Well, I mean, not really. Actually, right? Yeah, I have the same bugs in my system that the farm does, and so I'm not concerned about the raw milk system at all. And I think most everyone is going to be okay with raw milk. But our farm, being a commercial farm like it is, and being that we don't have our own bottling facility, we're going to sell to a co-op called Dairy Gold, and Dairy Gold is going to, in order for like liability, they're going to have to pasteurize that milk. They have 300 family farms that provide milk to them, and there is really high protocol. Dairy Gold has some of the highest protocols in the country for the safety of that milk, but nonetheless, Dairy Gold as a company doesn't have direct like management of each of those farms, and so as kind of this overall protection, Dairy Gold's going to pasteurize that milk and then turn it into cheese, butter. They're going to bottle it, chocolate milk. I mean, Dairy Gold makes all sorts of products. But for the most part, the milk that we create, except for the stuff that I use myself, is going to go the pasteurizing route, and that's more or less to protect the buyer of my milk, which is about 45,000 gallons every day is what I'm making, and shipping to Dairy Gold. In order to protect themselves, they have to go through that that pasteurization, so that they can not be on the hook for all that 45,000 gallons plus their other 300 farms as they sell that milk. Does that answer
So
your question, Ryan? Is that kind of what you're going for?
yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. With that in mind too, and how you were saying that you throughout the whole process, including the compost, and that you're in charge of that, I guess is what's a typical day look like then in the dairy operation for you?
It always starts off in the mornings, kind of checking on cattle, checking feed, reading bunks, making sure that the feeding systems are going well. That's a big part of healthy animals is what they're eating and what they're getting fed, and if they're on grass, making sure that everything's kind of going the right way there. So that's usually how my day starts. It's associated with animal health, primarily in the, the vertical of feeding them right. And then beyond that, I usually jump into some more like strategic stuff. Like we have, across the operations, a couple hundred employees. So there's just some strategic kind of operational things to make sure training's happening and some of that stuff that usually consumes a couple hours through the middle of the day. And then I usually end the day with just jumping into kind of the today's fires. Sometimes we're doing projects. Sometimes we're taking care of uh, fixing equipment. Sometimes it's back into the feed side with the cattle. Sometimes it's sticking with sort of the HR stuff on the business side of things. But yeah, it's a typical day. I kind of blend it between running the company and then still farming. It's kind of a collision of those two things.
Yeah, and then with the feed, how do you ensure? Well, I guess whenever researching the feed too, how did you come to decision on what type of feed that you'd be using?
I work with a couple different nutritionists to help me make some of those decisions, but most all of our feed we're growing on our farms. So I don't necessarily own those. My dad, brothers, uncles, cousins might own those farms, but I'm very much connected to those. and very much connected to what they're growing and how they're growing them. And we're on the same page, just trying to work together to regenerate everything. So I'm very, very lucky in that regard, because the feed that we're feeding our cows is the feed that we're growing for our cows, and with the mindset of density, nutrition density, and all the pieces that really, really have a positive effect on the animal's overall health.
Yeah, that's something from my experience that I haven't really heard too often of all the feed being grown on the farm. Because I know the farm I worked on, they had um, corn and whatnot that they grew organically, but that was also for in case the other feed that they actually have that they buy from a local farm goes bad or just doesn't work out as just a fail safe. So that's interesting, and that's also really interesting that you mentioned. So you have cousins and aunts and uncles, so it's not just your family that's farming too; it's your extended family as well.
Yeah, yep. They're all, this basin was created, really water came to the Columbia Basin here in the middle of Washington about um, 60 years ago. So really not that long ago in the scheme of things. And my grandparents were some of the first ones to move here.
Hmm.
They bought, it was part of a GI Bill. So if you served in the military in World War II or Vietnam, then you were put into a drawing, and you had the opportunity to buy ground for a really good price. And that drawing determined if you got the first pick or the last pick. And so, yeah, our family's roots are pretty deep here, and we are growing. We have been growing. The numbers of Allreds in my family that are here is more and more. And my objective over the last few years, it works because I have the ruminants, which are those incredible little magic makers that sit in the middle and recycle all their grasses and all their feeds that treat their soils the best. I can then upcycle those through a ruminant and turn them into protein. So it's been my objective to try to correlate and coordinate all those farming systems together to make us more sustainable for the long term, without a huge dependence on having to buy and bring import stuff in order to keep our farms operational.
Could you give a breakdown of that whole system at play too? Because I know you mentioned that you're in charge with the cattle, and then your father with the crops and potatoes. Um, yeah, I'd be curious how that system's at play, and then how. I'll just ask that question first.
So I think where it starts, and I mean, I'm sure you've done a lot of the regenerative stuff, and that's a big part of what you're what you teach on, what you share. But if I could come at it from an angle of just trying to make as many life cycles as possible for all of our goods and products that come off of our farm. So really, if we look at our farming operation as we're stewards over land and animals, um, uh, in the different soil and bugs and insects, we're stewarding this environment. And as we do that, this environment is going to give us the byproducts of beef and milk and potatoes and apples and cherries, honey, worm castings. That's what nature is going to give you if you treat nature right in the long term. And so as we take a step back and we just try to keep all of the carbon and all of those systems alive in our loops, then we will continue to be able to pull those byproducts off and sell those to be able to maintain finances of our farm. So, for example, we take our potatoes. Our potatoes almost all go to French fries, and when you're making a French fry, you're going to lose a third of that potato. So we will bring a third of that potato back, and we'll actually bring a third of most of the region's potatoes back to our cattle, and we'll upcycle those through cattle, which is so that potato, that byproduct, that potato is going to now get another life cycle through the ruminant, and it's going to be converted into milk, meat, and manure. And then if we jump in to the milk, meat, and the manure side, then you have another life cycle in the manure, and that manure is now going to go through a composting system, which is eventually going to make its way back to the soil. So everything on our farm that we're producing, whether for direct sale to a consumer, or, a retailer or wholesaler, or anything that comes off our farm, even if it's a waste product, we're going to try to send that through as many life cycles as possible, so that we can continue to maintain a sustainable, a farm that is thriving without a whole bunch of without bringing in a whole bunch of synthetics. So that's kind of the mindset. We could talk about it all day, the different life cycles we're playing, and I'm sure we'll jump into some of them more. But that's the idea.
So what I love about farming is nothing goes to waste, even waste. It's another reason that's just so fascinating about being on a farm is just you're being an artist in a way. The way you perceive your land just changes over time too, of how you can make it better, more efficient, but also better for the actual environment that you're stewarding. Yeah, it's just fascinating. Every single day is a new day, but you learn. I know this is the old saying is you learn something new every day, and on a farm you truly do. Because it's not every single day is a completely different day. There's no whether even though you're a dairy farmer, there's still so many different things that you might not be aware of that happen. I know I'm kind of rambling here, but it's I don't know. And then also you talking about this worm farm, which I think will be good to segue into. Can you just explain that? Because I've again never even heard of a worm farm really.
Yeah, so our worm farm is a little bit unique. It is a biofiltration system. So all of the wastewater that we come up with on the dairy and across the ranch and on the farm is a lot of it is full of nutrients that we want to upcycle, we want to put back into our systems and create, like I was saying, another life cycle. But in a lot of ways, it's hard to do that with the dirty water. You can't just spread it like that. That's like if you're not spreading it agronomically, you create problems. It stinks. If you let it sit for very long, it's what's going to release a lot of those gases, a lot of the ammonia and methane, which is obviously bad for the environment. But maybe even more significant to us, that is valuable to our soil. We want to keep that in our loop. We don't want that to go away out of our farm, or we have to go replace it with some more fertilizers. Um, so our worm farm is a bunch of long, skinny swimming pools that are full of wood chips from our retired apple trees, and then inoculated with worms. And and then over the top of it, we're sprinkling hundreds of thousands of gallons of dirty water. And as the dirty water settles through those wood chips, um, it's going to be filtered, cleaned, and by the time we collect that water off the bottom, it's clean enough that we can reuse it back either to clean out our systems on the dairy farm or that we can irrigate with it. So just another way to try to keep that water in a loop so that we can continue to use it and then pull as much of the nutrients into a form, aka like solid worm poop or solid manure, something that you can put in a truck, but converting all those nutrients into a form that we can reuse back into our systems. So the worms, this is a technology developed by a company called Biofiltro. It's a Chilean company. There's just a couple of smart dudes who kind of figured out this idea of worms and filtering through these different biomass systems. Um, and it's allowed us just to take some of our worst waste, which is shit water and green water, and turn that into clean water or cleaner water that we can either irrigate with or reuse to clean things. And on the other side of that, we're left with worm poop, which the worm is going to not just the worm's digestive system is upcycling those wood chips and that dirty water, all the nutrients that we're capturing. The worm's digestive system has the ability to multiply the microbials in those already nutrient systems. So that the wood chips and the dirty water are full of nutrients. The worms are going to 4 or 5x the microbials and the nutrients that are already a part of that system organically.
Dang, that's very cool. And the thing I like about this the most too, as soon as we're talking about it, it made me think about the massive hog lagoons, especially that are in North Carolina, and seeing the images of those, but also just all the health consequences in those surrounding areas. This is just such an incredible way to not let that happen. Yeah, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about with those massive hog lagoons that in the times whenever it rains, they overflow and then they just seep into the surrounding area. And like you were saying, with the nasty gases that happens there, and it's just really horrific because now that surrounding land for those massive pig operations is pretty much desolate, and you're forcing people out of a lot of their homes. And again, that's just why it's so cool that you're literally trying, as you continue to talk about upcycling and just all these life cycles as much as possible, but also keeping it within the context of your family operation. um, is something that's really cool. So that's all I
Thank you.
had to say with that.
Appreciate it.
I guess my next question then would be to just continue on talking about the whole system at play too. I guess if you could just give a breakdown too of everything that is a part of the royal family operation, because I know you also have the packing side of things. There's just so much that goes into agriculture, and with there's so much going in within your whole operation. Um, yeah, I didn't know if you'd be able to break that down.
Yeah. So I shared a little bit like on the dairy side, we're shipping our milk to Dairy Gold, and those animals, as far as our operation, they have to stay pretty close to home. They have to stay close to the parlor because they're getting milked a couple times a day. And so in that system, we're able to kind of divert a pretty robust composting operation off of that because that manure is mostly going to get collected kind of in a footprint, and we're able to collect that manure and then windrow it and have a composting system. So if we dive into that composting system, that's what's going to be taking a lot of our compostables and stuff, and we're going to be making a high quality compost and also making some garbage disappear. Our beef animals are going to move off of the dairy farm, and they're going to go and live out and about in the regions around us, being able to graze on the different cover crops that we have in play as part of our rotation. And so with that, we're able to take that manure to the soil. But then with the beef, when those animals are to the age or to the weight, then we're able to take those to Royal Pack, which is our processing facility, and we're able to convert those into beef. And that's a product that we sell pretty vertically integrated, pretty direct to the consumer. Um, and then apples and cherries, um, those fruits which get fertilized by the composting system, um, those fruits are going to be sent through our. I mean, we box those. My brother runs that side of things. He boxes those, and then we're going to sell those pretty retail, like to a lot of the big retailers. And we have a marketing desk called CMI that helps us kind of manage all of that. So those apples and cherries are going, more of a typical route. And then if we dive into the potatoes, well, on the apples and cherries, those wood chips, when those trees are retired, those wood chips are going to go back in the loop, and we're going to upcycle those through the worm castings. We're making biochar with our partners, and we'll upcycle those and put those back through the loop. And the apples and cherries will go mostly to Costco or Walmart or Kroger or some of our Sprouts and some of our partners on that side. And then potatoes, those are kind of a part of a rotation on that side of the farm where every 6 years we'll grow potatoes, and we sell most of those to French fries through the different like wholesaler French fry makers. And so we don't really vertically integrate on those, but we'll we'll use that crop as part of the rotation. Then we'll come back in with the cover crops that we're going to grow more for the cattle and keep the dairy and the beef side going, which is really what builds a lot of the soil health. It's the crops that you're growing for the cattle that build the soil health. When you're growing crops for humans, for the most part, you're going to put you're going to put additional pressure on that soil. So it's important to have the diversity there in order to sustain a healthy soil and a healthy yields that can be productive for year to year to year.
Can you elaborate more on the piece that you mentioned of if it's just for humans that adds more pressure?
Yeah, I mean, so if you're farming and you decide you want to put some of these vegetables that we might eat, and if our body can digest them, like potatoes, carrots, onions, those are crops around here. If our body can take a bite and really digest and utilize that, then almost always that crop is going to put additional pressure on the soil. That's going to, in order for that plant to prepare for our weak, in relation to cattle, our weak digestive system. Not really, but you see what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to put that additional pressure on the soil, and that plant is going to take more from the soil in order to get to that point, that state that we can eat them. And so you cannot just continue to plant those crops on the same plot of soil year to year to year to year, or you'll completely deplete that soil. So you have to take potatoes, for example, and if we have one field, we'll plant potatoes this year, but then we'll harvest those potatoes, and we'll spend 5 years growing crops for cattle, for the ruminant, because the ruminant crops are the crops that are going to, the grasses, the alfalfa, those nitrogen fixing crops that are going to be putting back into the soil as you rotate, as you'll bring that diversity into that rotation of that field. Is that answering your question? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely does. And then for growing the actual crops for the cattle, I guess how many acres or how much do you need to grow, say for one cow each year? I don't know if that is
Yeah, I mean, we have it broken down. Like each of our milk cows is going to need about a half of an acre a year, and that's different, right? Like we don't have, our cows aren't necessarily grazing all the time. Our beef animals are grazing, and we have some young stock that are grazing, but our milk cows are mostly getting fed a total mixed ration, a balanced diet. But we figure we need to grow at least a half acre for every cow that we have. And now and that's a milk cow. So with our young stock and our beef animals, we have to have some additional acreages to maintain that part of the herd.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then with the composting too, with just that scale of the amount of cattle that you have, what's that process like too? Because I haven't talked a lot about composting on this podcast just yet. So I'd also love to just hear that process and what's that like.
So something really cool about composting is if you have the right C to N ratio, so carbon to nitrogen ratio, then that composting process will be pretty natural. It's going to drive compost. If you are composting the yard clippings in your yard, it's going to be really hard to get a composting process to occur there because you have a whole bunch of carbon and no nitrogen. So you need to get the yard shavings plus some of your food waste, and you blend those together, and then you can start driving a composting process, the heating process that we call composting. So when a ruminant shats, they are shatting the right ratios of carbon to nitrogen. So because our base in our composting program is cow manure, ruminant manure, we set that ruminant manure in big old massive windrows. And then because it's got that ratio, that C to N ratio, then it has the potential to drive a whole bunch of energy on its own. So with that energy, we're able to feed in some of the other products. It might be maybe we need to make some ugly apples disappear. Maybe we have cardboard from our facilities that is garbage and we need to make it disappear. Some of those other compostables. This year we put a whole bunch of cherries that were too small or kind of had dings on them or worms in them. Those were part of it. We're feeding biochar, which is coming from our apple trees, into that. So our composting system, yes, the base is cow manure, but because that cow manure has the C to N ratio just right on, then we're able to feed that massive oven with additional materials that can also be composted in that process. So those windrows are laid out, and then you take a big old turner and we turn that windrow, introduce air, and that drives the middle of that pile to get really hot. Once it hits 150-ish degrees, then we'll go in there and we'll turn it again, meaning we'll take some of the manure from the outside, we'll throw it to the inside because it's yet to be composted, and then we'll introduce air back into that system and it drives again. So we're going to turn most of our compost 7 or 8 times on its way to being completely, fully composted.
And then from start to finish after those 7 or 8 terms, what's the length of days, weeks, or how long does that process take?
Yeah, it depends on the external, like the temperature outside. So winter time's going to take longer. But right now, if we are really efficient and really on it in the summertime, we can get a good compost turn happening every 2 months, 2.5 months. That
And
slows way down in the wintertime because you don't have the sunlight or the heat, the exterior heat to really help that process much. So you get plenty of heat on the inside, but once you turn it, it takes a lot longer to get that heat heating up again because you're introducing so much cold air inside that it's going to really have to get hot, 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 and it might take a couple, 3 weeks before you can turn it again. Versus right now, it's 2 to 3 days.
I also just probably should ask too, why even compost? What's so important about composting?
Versus just like laying out raw manure.
I guess versus just not composting at all. This is just a very basic question, but I just
Yeah.
wanted to, yeah, just talk all things
So
compost with that.
yeah, compost is such an incredible natural process that that we can take all of these waste products, manure being, I mean, I use air quotations, not that you can see me, but like a waste product. It's not really a waste product, it's a fertilizer. But you take these products that in their current state aren't super usable. And then like raw manure, stinky raw manure, if you spread it, you'll lose a lot of those nutrients because it's fairly volatile, especially when it's coming from like a feedlot operation, like a dairy like we have that's kind of closed. We have to collect that raw manure, and then putting it through the composting process is going to kill a lot of the pathogens. It'll kill the weed seed that might be a part of that manure. And then, as I kind of stated before, it also acts as sort of this big oven which you can feed other garbage, other compostable products into to upcycle those products into usable soil amendments. So the composting process is just another strategy that we can employ on our farm to really upcycle all sorts of different waste materials, waste products into really valuable soil amendment. So that compost is then going to be our primary fertilizer source as we're growing crops. And so we'll compost it, we'll put it in trucks, and then we're going to spread it across all of our farm, and so that it can grow crops for next year.
For the listeners that say might live in just like an urban environment and they live in an apartment or, yeah, an apartment, is it worthwhile for them to start composting?
For sure. I mean, if they're trying to grow more crops next year, compost is a fantastic fertilizer to drive that process. So soil is made up of air, water, mineral, and organic matter. And when you're growing crops, organic matter is going to be the first thing to be used or depleted in your soils. Air and water, as long as you're watering it, are going to kind of take care of themselves. Mineral, you have to keep an eye on, but that's more of a long-term play. But your organic matter is what you have to continue to feed your soil in order for your soil to maintain the category of soil, and meaning that it can grow crops. So by all means, take all your food waste, and if you can get that C to N ratio correct, then you can drive a really incredible composting process which eliminates the smell. It captures the nutrients so that they're not volatile anymore, and it gives you a safe soil amendment that you can reuse to grow next year's crops.
So my last question on this topic, say for one of the cows that they happen to get sick, are you able to use that manure at all, or what happens to that?
Yeah, yeah. If a cow's sick, the composting process is going to um, it's going to really like it's it's going to eliminate any of the pathogens that might be able to be transferred. So that's one of the biggest values of it is it's going to kind of reset all your goods. That's why it's okay to bring some rotten food and put it through your compost because that compost will really reset it and put it in a state that's safe.
Thank you. So I wanted to transition a little bit. Um, for the scale of your whole operation with your family and extended family, whenever strategizing, I guess, long term, because one thing that I've seen, well, statistically too, is just the sheer number of farms that continue to close down and how much smaller that's gotten on that paired with how difficult it is to sustain and have a profitable farm or ranch. With your size, do you, I guess, how do you go about planning that to, are you wanting to stick to the size that you have currently, or because there's just so many differences for a very small farm, a middle farm, and then a very large scale industrial or whatever you would want to call that operation. And there's just so many differences at each scale. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear where your thinking is for all of that, especially as it seems like the number of farmers and ranchers continues to dwindle.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a sad reality. Farming is hard, and farmers in general are getting less and less control of their prices. So a big part of why we're doing what we're doing is because we want to be able to make it in the long term. So we want to be able to not have to buy all these synthetics in order to maintain the crops that we're growing. And then beyond that, um, we want to be able to grow like the high quality goods that can be differentiated from your typical um, commodity. Because farming in general is all commodity based, and so your food is the same as everybody else's food, regardless of how it's grown. So we're trying to differentiate our food um, from others, uh, and that's an important aspect of what we're trying to do. Because we are a commercial farm. We're a big farm. The family's farm is they've been successful over the last 50 years, and um, really doesn't. We're all family owned, but it's a large operation that we're trying to crack this regenerative code at scale. Um, so as we look at this idea that farmers have never really had less control, especially on their prices, and now, as we're all aware of, our expenses are just skyrocketing, and we have very little control over our expenses either. Yeah, we can choose not to buy something, but that doesn't always solve the problem. Um, so farmers have never had less control, and yet on the other side, the end consumers have never been less connected to their farm. So there's this massive dichotomy in the middle that regenerative farming, what you're doing, is a big part of that solution. What we're trying to do is solve that problem at a real scale on a large operation. And then beyond that, we're trying to be very, very transparent. So that leads to our strategy of like putting everything in a blockchain. So all of our data going into a decentralized system that can go in the blockchain, and then we can share all of that information with the end consumer. And that's really important. Like the blockchain or the decentralized system is really important in that regard because that doesn't happen. Farmers don't share their data with just anybody, and nor should we ask them to. That's not fair, especially in a centralized system. But as we crack this code to be able to share all of these practices in our the nutrients of our food through this blockchain in a decentralized system with this new technology, that is going to be such a victory to help kind of bring this gap together of farmers without control and consumers that are frankly ignorant, never less connected, and to be able to marry those two together is what we're hoping to do with the grow technology on the blockchain.
I absolutely love that because transparency is so crucial, especially with, for example, the fact that, I mean, I know they're slowly changing the rule, but for the longest time it would say U.S. Beef, but it was imported from Brazil or New Zealand or Australia, and the end consumer has zero idea about that. On As well as a lot of organic produce in stores, they have workarounds, and there's no way for the end consumer to verify that whatsoever. Nor do most of them are even aware of that. They assume that organic means their food is pesticide and all this sprays free and this or that, but in reality, we have no idea. Um, and then on top of that, too, the end consumer also doesn't understand the economics of it either. So I'm wearing my hat, Make Milk Raw Again hat, and I'll read some of the comments that I get on Facebook, and some of them just talk about the price of trying to buy raw milk because typically it's quite expensive, especially compared to store bought milk. But there's a lot of reasons as to why that is. And it's not like it's because the dairy farmer has marked it up 1,000% and is making buku bucks off of you. There's just so much going on behind all of that, and I mean, that was why I had this brand in the first place, with the idea of that is there's so much happening to you all that we're not aware of. And but on the flip side, the only way this could really change is the end consumer and how they spend their dollar on their food, and yeah, where they get that from. So I guess with my next question, that is also asked a lot, and there's so many articles from people that write on. Do you think that regenerative agriculture is scalable?
Well, and that's a good question. That's a question that I'm presented with a lot because that's kind of where I live, is regenerative ag at scale. That's what we're doing, and that's what we're trying to do better every single day. Um, I do. I think it's scalable. Do I think that that one of the major solutions to solving a lot of our food challenges is more and more little farms? I'm 100% on board with that, and I think that's an awesome direction we need to head. But the reality is that most of our food is coming from large farms right now, and so we have to solve this problem on a large scale, and that's the world I live in. Um, there's no reason that we can't do a good job at a large scale. We can't collect our manure appropriately and get it processed appropriately and get it back to our soil appropriately. There's no reason why we can't use natural systems like a biofilter, the worm farm, in order to clean that water and get it back out there. Um, I do very much believe that we can get to a point where we can be regeneratively farming at a large scale. Now, is there going to be concessions? And I don't mean concessions in like practices, but does everyone need to maybe better understand what regenerative farming is? Do we got to define what that means a little bit better? Yes, we all are going to be learning along the way of what is regenerative ag, and that's where people are going to have to start to understand that some of these processes have a method to them, even if on the surface they don't like it. Like I've mentioned, my dairy farm is my animals, for the time when they're milking a lot, are in a confined space. Now they all have a water bed, they all have lots of space to move around, but during that period of time where it's about 100, 125 days from after they had a calf, they're going to be in a space that is a confined animal feeding operation space. Now there's a lot of reasons why we do that. We collect all that manure, we can go into that, but it's for the animals' sake, because they are running a marathon every single day. So to be able to have a bed, food that's available, water that's available in a climate controlled area is so important to them. So I guess what I'm getting to is, yes, I believe it is. We're going to continue to learn as we go in regenerative agriculture how to do this better. And then people are going to have to maybe start to understand some of these things on the surface that they don't agree with, or they think look ugly. Let's dive deeper into those. And that all starts with this transparency, and sharing that information back and forth and bridging that gap so that we can all dive deeper into what makes the most sense and what's the best thing for the animals, for the environment, for our food, for us. And really learning and going, learning and going, learning and going.
Do you see other large scale operations too open to the ideas or even implementing any type of regenerative practices? Because this is also what another reason why I have this podcast and just why I want to talk to as many farmers and ranchers in America is the fact that, well, one, I was a vegan for 2.5 years, and a lot of that was due to the industrial scale agriculture. And then for the longest time, I was not so happy about that. But now I've definitely changed my perception a lot and made sure to not demonize that side of things because that's not going to help anything. If this needs to be a collaborative effort, and if people are just yelling and blaming for this or that, that's no one's ever going to want to be open to even talking about regenerative agriculture or anything else like that. So yeah, I'm just curious if I don't know if you talk to other larger scale operations, and I would just be curious to hear what that's like.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting conversation. Some people, uh, a lot of farmers are so bent out of shape about people telling them how to do their job that oftentimes it gets really defensive. Like, oh, this is another one of those fake labels that the marketer can throw on something to make more money where I don't make any more money, or it doesn't make my farm any more sustainable. It's just a dog and pony show. So there is definitely some of that, and um, the farmers have been in the middle of those kind of top down schemes for a long time that leaves them no better off. And then there's a lot of the industrial systems that do have to change 100%. And so there's some defense in the fact that, like, you're coming on to say you got to do more work, different work in order to make this work. And so there's going to be some defense in that side of things. But by and large, the farmer, and I'm not referencing maybe necessarily like these like corporate type farms. I mean, but the family farmer, the successful family farmer, they are the original environmentalist, and those are people who are going to be open to the right adjustments. Now, is there going to be some of this like skepticism on some points? Yes, but a lot of those are because they know the reality of, like you were mentioning, like the USDA organic thing and what that means sometimes, and how the food labeling system is very much broken. So that's where the skepticism comes from, and we'll have to just keep working our way through it. But I think at the end of the day, the farmer is going to do what works and what makes sense, and that is regenerative agriculture, making some of these positive adjustments.
I can only imagine the feeling of, well, especially in your position to where you grew up in agriculture, reading or seeing articles from folks demonizing this or that, and they've probably never even visited a farm yet, alone worked on one. And that's what I always find so fascinating with that world is the whole research science thing of things, but then the journalism tries to speak on your behalf, even though again, a lot of them have zero experience in that. But now the general population would rather listen, or not rather, they do listen to those people instead of you all. Um, and that continues to make the massive disconnect that we do have to where now people believe that we should be eating less meat, being open to lab grown meat. I saw a Twitter post yesterday talking about a guy, how he's eating lab grown salmon, and then just the comments around all of that. Because then he was just talking about with the extinction of salmon and then eating lab grown instead, but then the consequences of all of that. It's just all over the place, and there's just so much information that's thrown on us. I mean, I even saw, I don't want to get too political, I just saw Kamala talking about this whole entire thing needing to minimize the amount of red meat. She even framed having a burger as if it's a one of those type of meals that's a nice to have once or every week or two, even though a burger is actually very healthy for you made right. Um, so yeah, that was just a long-winded way of just saying that. I can only imagine the pressure of all of that, but then sticking to your guns, especially as a family unit.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and you're right. I mean, I think it's a crazy world, and the social media thing's just blowing it up more. The politics are just blowing it up more because people are weaponizing kind of environmental concerns, um, and so being able to have transparency and really keep the dialogue and the data accurate and open and available is so very important. I think to solve the overall problem that we're discussing. That's why we've teamed up with Grow United, which is a blockchain that we're starting to put all this information on because I think that's the way of the future. I think we have to be able to share our information, and I think the consumer is willing and excited to be able to learn about that and what goes into growing that food. And so it's just such a critical aspect to getting us to where we all want to be, and that's a, a, a food system that's safe, that's good, that's high quality, that's not scarce, that we have available, even during pandemics that shut down some of these supply chains, like regenerative agriculture and putting that data on a blockchain, and having that data available and that connection between the producer and the consumer is all stuff that I think we can pursue in order to solve those problems.
I think the last question I have before ending the podcast is on that blockchain technology. Yeah, can you just explain that and what that looks like for the end consumer?
Yeah, so blockchain is just really just a fancy way of saying like all that data is collected in a way that it's open source for anybody to see. Now it can be anonymous, yes, but it's open source for anyone to see. So that allows that end consumer to be able to buy fruit or vegetables or beef. And so for my beef, for example, you can buy that beef and then you can scan the QR code and it'll send you to that blockchain and it'll show you when that animal was born, what it ate, what its footprint was, where it lived through its life, which is for my beef is all locally here. And so all that information will then be available to that end consumer. Eventually, they can use, down the road, that's cryptocurrency can be utilized to buy those things. But that's where people start getting like confused. Set that aside. You can buy the meat with just complete transparency on it, and then part of that is getting that untampered data that's in a decentralized system to be able to start making the right decisions. Because right now, most of the data we're dealing with is owned by centralized systems, and then it's just easily maneuvered and manipulated to support whatever they may want to support. But once we start having real data about our food, about our systems, then we can start making real adjustments that help us solve these problems at a real scale.
That's so cool. Especially me personally, I'm a big Bitcoiner and have been for quite some time. So seeing or just hearing that and thinking about that in the long run is something that I would love to have. So
Yeah,
that's
check out like Grow United, and then if you want to buy our meat, you can buy an NFT of our meat, and you can use Grow tokens to buy it, and that'll be shipped to your door with that transparency in it, and it can all be part of a decentralized system.
very cool. I guess before going, if there's any last things that you would like to mention or any social media that you'd like to plug.
Well, I appreciate you doing this, Ryan. I think we're aligned on trying to get this out there. I think it's so important to try to make that connection between the end consumer, the producer, and doing all that right stuff. So thank you for what you're doing. We're on social media. Royal Family Farming is our Instagram and Facebook. And then, yeah, if you want to learn more, that's our website, royalfamilyfarming.com. And then the blockchain stuff is Grow United, and that works with our Royal Family Farming website. But all that stuff, thank you so much for having me on, and appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you. Visit www.theregenaissance.co to learn more.